Cool. I guess we're good to go then, right?
Yep.
Hi, Chris, pronouns he, him. So POIs in the chat, please. I'll try to take you some point during my speech, but if I forget, then like maybe do an like voice POI after like 5:30 if I haven't taken it yet. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So firstly, before I go into like 3 arguments about firstly why we think that like this economic growth provides political stability that enables good environmental policy. Secondly, about how short-term costs are better thus in the long term for the impacts. And thirdly, why we change certain like consumer preferences. I'm going to just characterize what this motion I believe looks like. So what do we have to defend on our side of the house? We must defend that like economic growth looks like more trade between countries, and like just like more probably tax revenue and like income that like the government can get from taxing like the economic growth in general, and therefore like they can overcome certain collective action problems through government funded programs, is better than contrasted with economic stagnation. What does economic stagnation mean? Obviously it doesn't mean that you got like negative GDP growth, right? But there's a lot more volatility, like firstly a lot more volatility in that growth, meaning that you get a lot like more pronounced business cycles, meaning that it is far more difficult for politicians and for any like sort of activists to also like predict like when you can reinvest certain resources in defending like animal rights or like greener policies, right? But but secondly, it also means that like nations are incredibly like reliant still on burning like fossil fuels or like promoting policies that have been like um, just provide stability, have provided stability in the past. Thirdly, they're probably like going to use a lot more of their natural endowments as a basic like amortization mechanism in times of like economic crisis, right? They're going to cut down more rainforests. That means that like a lot of the habitats of the animals are going to be destroyed, or they're just going to eat like extract minerals from the ground that are like a very quick fix for the like state revenue or like business revenue, whatever that is, right? Fourthly, they're far less likely under this like the conditions of volatility to just like put in new like environmental regulations, as those are probably going to be very popular, such as on like energy efficiency, right? Or they're not going to do like very long-term projects that don't have an immediate payoff, right? Because a lot of people might like succumb to the harms of that economic instability under their side of the house. Then, having explained this 3 arguments, so onto the first one about how we think that political stability that we uniquely get under our side of the house gets us also the good environmental and pro-animal rights policy. So what do we think happens under economic stagnation and the political landscape regarding the political capital uniquely? 3 things here. First, I think that politicians are incentivized to like give very, very quick fixes to a far greater extent. I know that like Op is going to come up and say, oh, the politicians like probably the same, right? Because you have like short-term election cycles, etc., etc. But I think that there's still a lot of a comparative, because in many things that like you can do, the economy is the one thing that you cannot like kind of disregard, because people have like very easy time visualizing simple GDP numbers or simple unemployment numbers within that given moment, right? So if those are not set correctly, you as a politician are going to be far more pressed to like pay attention to this issue, as opposed to like oh, we might not just look at this, but instead do like greener environmental policy in general, right? Secondly, like it's easy to point to politicians and say, you're dismissing like human suffering as opposed to animal suffering. Like I think that this is like very intuitive, that like in many instances media is just going to have a field day of saying, oh, this politician is just like not keeping in touch with the economy, they should care about people more, as in terms of animal rights. That happens under economic stagnation. It's very hard to push these things up in the policy agenda. How do we change that? I think we change that in like 2 main ways. Firstly, you simply have like more wiggle room for politicians to look at long-term policies that are not completely immediate, meaning like if you have to put like regulatory standards or say, oh, we shouldn't cut down rainforests right this second, right? Because like our economic growth and economic numbers are like decently good, right? But secondly, you probably get like under like pronounced like economic growth, you probably have like more support for green policies in general, as like we can assume in general in this motion that like if you get more economic growth, we have more human capital and more people get educated as like the country transitions into service industries. Probably it means that like people start caring about the issues that are not in their immediate vicinity, meaning they're probably gonna care about environmental policies in general, because they like are less susceptible to like economic populism, right? What is the impact of this? I think then like we can promote a lot of the green policies, like not depletion of natural resources, of introducing regulatory standards, getting green energy in, but also like putting things into like investments that otherwise would seem like more risky, so you can increase the percentage in your portfolio that's seen as more risky or not as an immediate payoff as a government or even as a business, right? The second argument then deals with like why we think that even if we like concede some short-term costs on environment, like on the environment, why it's better for the long-term impacts. First, as already kind of noted, like you move into the like service sector of the economy, because like if you're under industrialized, you're probably still going to have to move like burn a lot of fossil fuels. You're going to have to like do very intensive farming that like gives you lower crop yields because you can't invest that much into like increasing crop yields and therefore feeding more people, or you don't have the technology, or you might not have a way to like grow more sustainably, right? So you erode the soil more, etc., right? So on our side of the house, yes, we might have like environmental degradation in the short run, but in the longer run, right, we are like far more likely to then like lessen the pollution because our economies become more digitized, etc. Under economic stagnation, it's not really clear about the time frame. So therefore, like under the weighing, it seems that like it's much more preferable to just say, if we get industrialized, it's far more certain that we then are able to like enact all of these choices. Before I move on, I'd love to take closing. Opening.
No growth is enough growth. Once you achieve 5% of GDP growth, you want to achieve 6. The cycle never stops.
I mean, no, like it's not really true, right? Like obviously, like if you have more volatility or even like negative growth at some points, or if you stagnate, like because you don't get any more investment, like there must be some comparative in this debate, right? You can't just say it's a wash. Second thing under like why short-term costs are not that bad. I think that like the green technology that even some states under this new growth can achieve is going to trickle down to others. Like think about technology that you develop, right? First, iPhones are very expensive. Now they're cheap and okay, not iPhones, sorry, like mobile phones in general, right? We're like an exclusive exclusive commodity that nobody could afford, right? But now they like more people have gotten it because it like kind of trickles down. The same is going to happen like with the when West or like more advanced economies just are the first ones to like achieve the finish line of getting more like or cheaper greener technology, therefore like can dispense it a lot sooner to like still industrializing economies, right? So therefore this rapid growth even in some economies, like even if the whole world is like not achieving this, it's still better for the developing countries of like lessening the impact of climate change and that impact on animals, right? It's still beneficial on our side of the house. So we don't have to like necessarily prove that everyone grows immediately. Because of all these reasons, I think it's an OG win.
Okay, we thank that speaker for the eloquent speech, and now we invite the leader of the opposition.
This is good.
Yep.
Awesome. I quickly first want to start off explaining the world that we support. On our side, what stagnation means is that sort of either the economy stays as is, so that it's not growing more, or it also decreases. The big thing I want to note here is that growth is dependent on the economic growth, and the way that it's measured, like quite literally by economists, is dependent on the production of goods and services. And that's, for example, how GDP growths are also mentioned. This is not economic development, which considers the human capital formation, inclusion of like education or healthcare. This is growth. And so we're strictly sticking to GDP numbers, which is dependent on the production of goods and services. This is a very important clarification I want to make up top. Okay, I'll make two very simple claims in this speech. The first thing I'm going to talk about is why economic growth is in direct opposition to the interests of non-human animals. Here I will engage with the entirety of OG case as well, rebutting it and making a positive material. And the second thing I'll do, this is a really fun argument. I don't know if it'll work. I hope it does because I really like it. I'm going to take government bench at their best case. I'm going to assume that when growth increases, there's an increase in veganism. There's, at their best case, better technology also. You shift from factory farming to manufacturing. And I'll explain why that is in in tension with the interests of non-human animals. Okay, let's get started. First, on the first argument on why it's just like direct opposition to the interests of non-human animals. I have a few things to say here. The first mechanism is that for any kind of economic growth to occur, you need to clear out large amounts of land. This is very intuitive, but let me explain. For example, for you to build another factory or like build like a resort, you need to chop down entire rainforest and in which entire species reside, so they often die and who don't have a lot of people taking care of them. Or for example, when you clear out what was previously grazing land that animals fed on because you realize it's not worth it anymore and we need to build another factory here or build like a road, etc. The second thing is that because of the growth and the production that comes with it, there is a massive amount of toxic byproducts that are produced that also hurt animals. So when you burn fossil fuels or when you create create waste arising from CO2 or carbon monoxide, what that does is that given that these are incredibly harmful substances and are dumped and therefore pollute things like water bodies, the waste also being dumped in forests also actively hurts animals. It spoils their entire ecosystem, leads to the death of many of them. Opening government and closing government might respond by saying that, and like they did, which is like, you can regulate them as economies grow, etc. I think that you can never regulate them, especially in the farming area, but also in general, like firstly, corporations hold disproportionate amount of power. They fund politicians. This is more than any individual or even a block of like 100 different voters allying against this corporation. The second reason is that corporations can also control media narratives and therefore control the minds of individuals. Therefore, this never becomes a voting issue. So for example, they can say that we're doing this for you, that we care more about humans. So when, for example, you're building like another resort, you can just say, like we're serving human interests. And intuitively, I think that humans care more about themselves than animals that they probably don't relate to or don't have a lot of similarities with. Given that animals can't talk, you can't sympathize with them on a much more direct level than you can with other humans, which means that any kind of regulation is unlikely to work to begin with. The third thing, though, is that the way that all of these impacts culminate is that as growth occurs, humans also just live longer, right? This is very intuitive, but again, like life expectancy just categorically does increase as countries grow. This is because wages increase, which means that you can support things like healthcare. As economies grow, you can also afford things like better technology, which prolongs your life expectancy. All of this means that the impacts that I talked about in terms of clearing land, toxic byproducts, all of those are increased on our side of the house. Now, let me talk about technology within this argument as the fourth thing. This also responds to everything that OG has said. I think that a few things to be noted on technology. The first is that let me take them at their best case, that the production of technology does happen. I want to note that the production of technology in and of itself creates massive harms to animals. This is because, for example, things like lithium, that's also just waste, and that also is something that is eventually dumped. So just the production of technology in and of itself also runs into the problem of creating lots of toxic byproducts that ends up hurting animals. But this is assuming that technological development even happens to advance the interests of animals. There are a few reasons why this will never happen on their side of the house. A few things. The first thing is that corporations are short-termist. The way that they function is on things like quarterly reports. So each middleman or even each executive is beholden to like shareholders who are big shareholders who are presented with quarterly reports, which just means that like every 3 months you need to show massive amounts of growth and profits for the company. So this kind of projects are never passed to begin with. But secondly, I think that research and technological advancement is very uncertain. For example, what if another corporation develops this technology before you, patents it? So this just means that you are in a massive loss and all the work that you did for 2 years is lost. But you also don't know if like the technology that you're creating is actually going to be created. So the cost of just like even starting the process is quite high. Most corporations don't do it. The third thing I want to note specifically with respect to like factory like farming is that most like animal and meat production is controlled by big factory farms. They face little competition. And this is really important because this then means that there's no incentive for you to innovate to begin with. The last thing I want to note to close this argument, and this also responds to everything that OG has said, is ask the question of how much growth is enough growth. Because basically when you have massive amounts of like economic growth upward trends, the previous political party had a consistent growth rate of 5%. That's the benchmark. So the next political party that comes into power wants to top that. And this is why my POI matters. That just wasn't answered by OG at all, right? Because this means that no growth is enough growth. You never stop. Before I move on, Umesh.
The capacity to improve animal welfare, not the incentive, even the capacity requires economic surplus, the ability to invest. How do you have that on your side?
I mean, I've proved why, like with growth, you just fuck the interests of non-human animals. But so even if theoretically there's capacity, I've literally proved you that there's no incentive at all. The last thing I want to note is that when growth is the big thing, that's what's being discussed in media and political circles. How much growth we can get more, right? When that's the thing that you're focusing on, like attention for things like animal and environmental issues also does not exist. So for all these reasons, it's in direct contention. Now let's move on to the more fun argument. Let's concede to everything that they say. As our absolute worst case, veganism increases, you shift from farming to manufacturing. The comparative on their side is that these animals don't exist. This is because a lot of these animals, especially for meat production, are bred. So inbred. So if meat production did not exist, these animals wouldn't have come to existence in the first place. So on their side, the comparative is not them living better lives, but them not living at all. Why is this worse? One, animals can have positive experiences for the first time. They can eat, especially farm animals are well fed because they need to be kept healthy, because like meat needs to be healthy. Secondly, they can interact with the surroundings around them. They can hug their mother. They can play with other animals around them. These are all positive experiences. But finally, the process of death is quite swift. So at best, you feel pain for 10 seconds, but you feel joy for like a year. So in their best case, even if all of that they're saying is true, the comparative is these animals not existing. I think that's worse than them being alive.
Okay, great. We thank the speaker for the eloquent speech, and now we invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Is everybody able to hear me?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Then I'll take POIs. I like to see the little yellow hands because that kind of helps signify to me. But if you can put it in chat too, both help me just so I don't miss anything. I'm probably going to take the closing half. All right, I will begin in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I would like to do is fight on the characterization debate that's kind of going on, because I mean, we pretty much agree with OO. I mean, like, there's not really any substantial difference. We believe that stagnation is basically when you've got constant rate of economic size in terms of goods and service production, and growth is good when you increase goods and service production. But their characterization that like, oh, this is very different than what we said, all we're doing is we're emphasizing the service end of that equation. Because the problem with good production is that we rely significantly on natural endowments and resources, which require like the destruction of animal habitats to a significant degree. Meanwhile, if you got a service industry, I mean, think about like a call center. You need one factory, you got a bunch of dudes on phones, and bam, you've got business. And that's not something that requires an insane amount of carbon output, greenhouse gas emissions, and all that stuff. So that's better for the environment, which leads to less deforestation, which is pretty much acknowledged mechanization. Just to give a clear mechanization on that way we're all clear on it. If there is greenhouse gases, this means that there are greater global warming. Greater global warming means that plants and animals are unable to live in their current habitats. They're forced to leave it. Things burn down, wildfires, yada, yada, yada. Canada is a great example of that. Moving on, though, however, we also want to say that since there's no fight on the characterization, we can move down to the specific argumentation. Their first argument is that economic growth is inherently against non-human animals. This is pretty problematic because some of their arguments are pretty unsupportive of this claim. First off, they say that growth requires land. This is not a valid assumption. They use the example of resorts. I use an example of a call center. What happens when we increase that call center? We basically abandon all the land that would have been used for the usage for like extracting natural resource from the ground or for farming, and then we can tear down those buildings and recultivate environments. This means that we can effectively allow for environmental rejuvenation where human societies have previously been built in order to extract resources. This means that we're actually able to reverse the effects of negative economic environmental degradation that's happened through the result of industrialization. Because we want to lead into the service economy and therefore undo these impacts. The second thing that they talk about is like fossil fuels and resource use hurts the ecosystem. Not all resource usage is necessarily against the environment. And this is where it becomes really critical to understand what is a fair characterization of our burdens in this debate. It is unfair to say that we have to defend the specific type of economic growth that a lot of countries tend to pursue where it's purely destructive of the environment. If there's a world in which economic growth can be pursued in such a way that it is legitimately sustainable, as in you're not destroying the environment in such a way that your society will not last more than 50 years because London's going underwater, then that's the one that we're pursuing. Because currently we're not having sustainable economic growth. We're advocating for actual sustainable economic growth, wherein we use natural resources and we use renewable resources like solar and wind technology. This is a viable alternative, especially considering the fact that countries like China have been dumping these natural resources and reducing the cost of solar cells since the late 2000s, meaning that the price of these solar cells is extremely cheap with a relatively insignificant upfront cost. And so it's a viable alternative that a lot of people are switching towards, especially now as coal becomes more expensive. This is we also move forward to their argument that we cannot regulate corporations because they have political power. This is just a gross exaggeration of the situation, because even in the United States, we have had massive levels of regulation that have gone on companies, specifically factory farming. Look at, for example, the way that chicken coops have been regulated in recent years. Like the level of outcry that's come from the public and reaction to the abysmal conditions in which chickens have been living has led to substantial forms of regulation and substantial amounts of investigative journalism to follow up on those regulations. And this means that there's public pressure that does change corporations' incentives. And this is partly because we do not have a single dominant elite, as the opening opposition characterized. There's a variety of different elites that fight for very different objectives. And some of those elites argue for what the public would call humanitarian objectives, or the treatment of non-human animals with dignity. Next, I'm going to move on to their arguments that as growth occurs, humans live longer and there's higher consumption. Another thing to counterbalance that fact, though, is the fact that, like, look, people also, as they get wealthier, have less kids. So bam, less consumption there. Like a few years here means that you've got significantly less people, though, because like the populations are declining. Kind of balances out each other, to be honest. And also, as people are living longer, I mean, like, if our rule is that like human beings living 2 years is going to be destroying like significantly greater numbers of animals, like I just don't buy that to be like a marginal impact worthy of consideration next to the other thing. Next, I want to move on to the arguments about technology. The production of technology like lithium, they say, will lead to dumping and things like that. However, if we're talking about actual technological innovation that's actually sustainable, then we're going to find ways of renewing and reusing these resources, which is actually what's happening in the case of lithium batteries, where there's all types of programs where we're able to reuse these. So basically, all I'm asking is that we don't interpret sustainable growth in its worst possible characterization, which is what the opening opposition is trying to do in a straw man fallacy of sorts. Can I please take this POI from somebody, preferably closing half? No. Opening half then? No. Okay, moving on.
Sorry, point.
Yeah.
Why is it inherently the case that the things that are produced to help animals will be used to help them and not control the ecosystem to, say, produce more food for ourselves, make more fat chickens? Why wouldn't we use that technology, like with that technology?
Because it's simply just not sustainable in most cases. Like I'm talking about legitimately sustainable economic growth. And if it requires those types of things, usually that's one, not economically as valuable in most cases. I mean, sometimes it is, but even when that's the case, it requires extreme, like unsustainable environmental practices, which are not good for economies in the long term. And the whole thing that we're emphasizing is that the short-termism that the opening opposition has been describing is simply not like a valid characterization of what we would be pursuing if we were pursuing actual sustainable economics. Because like sustainable economics means that we are actively focused on making sure that we're not destroying the environment that we're going to need to use in the future to sustain ourselves. Anything that's pro-environmental degradation is not pro-sustainable economies, and we should reduce the false equivalency that opening opposition has tried to create for us in this debate. Next, they say things about like factory farming has like less competition in developed economies. This is just not true. Also, we see the greater usage of local provisions of agricultural products because people want to shop locally and grow organic and stuff like that. So I just think that that's a false characterization. People are more conscious about all of these things because they're like, oh, I have the money now that I can buy these things. And so if I can do that, and I'm also tending to be more educated because I'm in a wealthier society, then I don't want to buy things that I know are going to destroy the environment and the people around me. So I mean, like, I just don't buy that in that front because there's going to be greater competition and therefore also less like massive factory farming. They say how much growth is enough. Growth is good so far as it doesn't endanger our future prospects. There's your short, clippy answer, and that's what sustainable economics is. Bam, like I don't know. They kind of just try to pretend like we don't have an answer, but we gave them an answer before. Their argument about veganism being bad is just not really that acceptable, to be honest, because they're like, oh, their first experiences of joy are important, but they're like, not when we're considering the fact that we're putting them in excruciating pain, basically torturing them as they die. Like, I just don't buy that as the argument. And like, honestly, like the idea of being bred to be killed and like destroyed and like tortured, like I just don't buy that as like a reasonable thing worth saving. At that point, they should just not exist. I don't think that like also the number of like we can still say that animals would be able to persist in their own habitats, so the species would get to persevere and continue. Yeah, cheapening green technology is kind of our way of going about this. Like honestly, that's the impact. That's the way we grow economically and sustainably. Thank you.
Okay, thank that speaker for the eloquent speech, and now we invite the deputy leader of the opposition.
Yeah, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Three parts to this speech. Firstly, framing, second on weighing, and thirdly on economic transitions. On framing, I want to make this absolutely clear. opening government or government bench at large is supporting a world where you have sustained economic growth, i.e., as DPM says, that you have growth, that the environment isn't getting screwed over as you do it. What we are saying is that what that necessarily translates to is if you're at 4 percentage points or 4% growth, you have to stay at that at the very least. But ideally, to get their impacts of sustained growth, green energy, solar panels being installed, you need to first do a lot of growth in a conventional sense to then get that tech, which means that all of Kaustubh's argumentation about creating the factories, about, for example, clearing out forests to set up that infrastructure to eventually get all the tech they want for having sustained economic growth, you necessarily have to go through that process. Our world, on the other hand, is of stagnated economic growth, i.e., your economy either stays as is or at worst goes down, i.e. consumption goes down, i.e. production goes down, right? So I think in terms of framing, this is crucial because in order for them to access their long-term impacts of green technology and sustainable growth, they need to first do conventional growth to get electric cars, to get electric buses, and all of that sort of stuff to not hurt the environment, which means our argumentation does apply. And in that time period, they are screwing over the environment, and we'll show to you why that is bad. The second thing I want to do then is weigh. Government's broad claim in this debate is a sustained economic growth is better for animals because better environmental policies come about, and that's good. I want to note 3 things. One, even if in the long run they are able to acquire this technology and have sustained economic growth that isn't hurting the environment or animals, their impacts are far less certain than ours. Why is this the case? The core reason for this panel is a sustained economic growth or economic growth, however you want to put it, is an infinite sequence, i.e. you do X percentage economic growth now, the next political party has every incentive to do X plus 1. Because remember, this policy is being executed by political parties and technocrats. This is not being executed by like OG who think like, oh, if it like the environment goes down and it hurts the environment, we're going to stop economic growth. You have to view this debate from the practical lens of the politicians and people who will actually be executing it, and they have to pander to political incentives and electoral votes. What that means then is that is an infinite sequence. You have X percent growth right now, you want X plus 5 years later, X plus 10 in the following year. What that then means is that growth keeps happening, and in that time frame, till you don't have enough sustained green technology, you will keep clearing out factories. You will still want to get out lithium batteries that hurt the environment to put them in fucking Teslas. So what that necessarily then means is that growth keeps on going. Secondly, even if this policy is being carried out by the most rational-minded people, there is quite literally no consensus on how much growth is enough growth. That's why the POI matters, right? So you will keep on going in this infinite loop until that never ends. But thirdly, we would posit that more growth entails more people being born, and this is true for the developing world in particular. Sure, the developed world might have like an aging population and lower birth rates, but for the vast majority of the world, if they want the aggressive growth they want, and if they want it quickly, that means you have to grow and expand quicker, which means more production, more consumption, higher wages, more factories, more jobs. All of that necessarily then means is that you have more people out there, and as such, you're going to have an increasing population for a couple of years. But even if you don't have an increasing population, let's say after 50 years, you have more medication. People live longer, right? So in either case, it applies. The impact of this is that even if they're able to achieve their long-term impact, it is uncertain compared to ours, which is far more certain. That is, you have the economy as it is, and you just keep it as it is. That means oil production doesn't go up or down. In fact, it could probably go down because stagnation means the economy might dip, right? It means that, for example, if consumption is at X percent, it might go to X minus 5%, right? What that then means is that on our side of the house, by default, our impacts are far more certain than theirs, which is why they should be weighed more. Secondly, even if in the long run they have better technology, it's bad because of irreversibility. That is to say, in your process to acquire green technology, in your process to make the world better, you need to necessarily do growth in the middle that's conventional in it. That is to say, you need to make factories, jump from the primary sector to the manufacturing sector, which is, by the way, true for 70% of the world, given that it is developing, right? What that then means is aggressive growth in the conventional sense to achieve their eventual long-term outcome. Now, government bench can do one of 2 things. One, they can do slow growth, but if they do it slowly, they get the green tech in a far longer time. In that time period, many animals die, their lives can't come back. Or secondly, they do it extremely aggressively and achieve their outcome quicker, but in that time period, more animals are dying. Either way, they have lost enough lives of animals, and these lives cannot come back. Lastly, worst case scenario, these animals die. I think Kaustubh's fun argument about the fact that, for example, these animals get the opportunity to live, that death will be swift, and they can implement some sort of joy outweighs them. on economic transitions then. The first thing I want to note is that when sustained growth is the core goal of every political parties keep trying to one-up the other one. What that necessarily then means is that the political discourse, the social discourse, is not towards non-human animals, but is towards growth. This sidelines all political preferences that are related to non-human animals and sidelines social movements. Our world of stagnation is one where nobody expects, the political parties don't expect, the business lobbies don't expect, the average voter doesn't expect more economic growth to happen. What that then means is that you can sideline the economy by default and move towards things like social movements and non-human animals movements actually advocating for better green policy. Secondly, we would posit that when you have more growth, business lobbies are more empowered. So sure, OG might claim that sustained economic growth is good for the environment, but when you have more growth in the intermediate, you have business lobbies that are growing who have incentives to not move away from cheap natural resources to renewable resources for all the reasons of quarterly reports and that COSA gives you that these political parties have. Thirdly, we think that, look, they say that everyone's going to be service oriented at some point, and that's going to be great. Here's the problem. No, not the whole world can't be service oriented, right? The third world will have to go from the primary to the manufacturing sector. So even if the first world is completely service oriented, the vast majority of the world will have to become manufacturing in the way they are. This means more factories. This means more trade happening between countries. That means more transport, more larger carbon footprints, coral reefs being destroyed because of oil spills and whatnot. What that necessarily then means is that more animals get screwed over on their side of the house in the vast majority of the world, because the developing world has more land mass. More land mass means more animals getting screwed over means government bench is losing. But lastly, we would also posit you have far higher populations on their side of the house. That is to say, in the developing world, in the intermediate, you're getting more and more people being born because of the access to a better life. And eventually, even if you have a population that stagnates, you have people living for longer, meaning that consuming more and more animals as well. In all these cases, what you're having then is a lot of growth. Even if it's sustained according to government, it is hurting the environment. Crucially, panel, note, even if government bench promises you that they can get sustained economic growth eventually in the intermediate, they are killing way more animals than we do and we ever will, because our world is far more certain and stagnated. Theirs is an infinite loop of growth, and they keep going in it. More animals suffer. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank that speaker for the eloquent remarks, and now we invite the member of government.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Cool. Speech will start at my first word. I'll probably take a POI from around like 4. The O case doesn't make really sense to me, right? They're trying to say that like the more development you have, the more animals will be harmed in some capacity by nature. But just think about like 1900s, when the only kind of fur that I wore on a jacket was made from animals, compared to now where there's an equal distribution of how much is made from animals and how much is not. Because note that people will still continue to grow. Human beings will still continue to grow, and you would still have to meet the demands. But when economy stagnated and you don't have that development, you only give them conventional forms of methods of satisfying their demands. So you still give furs made of animal fur, you still give them food that is meat, but you're not like innovating to solve demands in multitude of ways, right? So even if they have stagnation in the future, they would still have to rely on these conventional methods to feed and satisfy these group of people, because just human beings are growing, population is growing. I don't know what solution they have there, right? But I also want to talk about like what people think about the end goal of like innovation, right? And what do people think about the future to look like? Because like, as you see how the growth has happened, we have become less reliant on nature for the particular growths, and we have become more reliant on innovation. So like we moved from having just raw animal growth or raw plants to moving towards processed food. And our end goal is having like pills. Like when I imagine like the future 100 years later, I imagine pills that I can take that have taste amazing food that make me feel satisfied and also give me nutrition, right? That's what people look like towards the end goal of food. And that's what people also think is like more satisfying to them and more convenient to them in the future, because also people care about other things like nutrition, about getting fit and so forth, which then means that when incentives happen, when you're able to promote that you have like these sort of vegan products available, which are also health-wise superior, you get access to those, right? So I'll do a few things now. I'll first like give a framing of like what like economic stagnation looks like. So I think there are two common features in economic stagnation, right? High inflation and like more unemployment that exists. So other than GDP, there are many indicators to measure like economic stagnation. I think more unemployment is a direct co-result of it, right? And I also want to point out that as they say corporation are short-termist, I think governments are also short-termist. That is, governments are not looking into future, but when they're in a recession or they're in economic stagnation, they care even more short-termist because they want to signal to people that they care about this. They want to get out of this, which means they want to take every effort possible to get out of this economic stagnation, right? Which then means that they have more incentive for these conventional products without caring about a lot of these things on their side. But I also want to talk about how people behave in a recession and like give mechanisms on like how it affects animals and pets, even if factory farming is a wash, right? Because note that when you have recession, when people cannot afford basic food, you get decrease in adoption, more pets being left outside, right? Like people lose houses during these sort of situations, which means their pets also lose houses. So their capacity to take care of their pets often means they often leave them in street in third world countries, but also give them up for execution or those sort of things. But also note that you get far more euthanasia that's often crueler, because often at times you just like all of these like animal shelters just get vast more amount of animals coming in than they can actually like ethically take care of, which just means you get far more unethical euthanasia that happens to these animals, or they're put in far like worse conditions in status quo because like you just don't have money, people cannot feed their animals, you get far more. But also note that like government is able to invest into things like, for example, like neutering and so forth that happens in status quo, right? Because they have the welfare. So these programs often take a backbiting. That is, you don't invest in things like neutering animals, vaccination, because you have more proximate goals. Look at the history of India in the last 50 years and the influx of like street population of animals. It's because the government doesn't have incentive to want to do it because they have more proximate interests that they need to take and care about, right? Which then means, but there's also other things that happen, right? People have like psychological and economic depression. People feel psychologically depressed, economic depressed, which just means that this results in them treating their animals far worse than they do. But also people who are relatively like more cruel to animals do it more as a source of venting. But finally, rural areas, right? Rural areas just do far more poaching. They do far more hunting because this is cheaper than going to the market and buying food that's extremely heavily priced when you can do it yourself. So you get far more poaching that's often crueler, far more hunting that's even crueler than, for example, factory farming. And they're okay with this risk because like at least they're getting to feed themselves, right? All of this means that a vast amount of animals are hurt during times of economic recession or economic stagnation by these individual people. I'll take OO if they have something.
Yeah, you're pushing a burden that we don't need to defend, because if governments don't want to keep the economy stagnated, then they grow and then they maintain that consistent level of growth. That's your world. We don't need to defend that at all on opposition.
No, but the point is like governments still have incentive to like get out of economic stagnation, right? Like just because you're in economic stagnation doesn't mean you cannot try for like economic growth and still not get it. Look at, for example, Argentina, that has been in economic stagnation for like the past 20 years, right? But it's not growing, but it's trying every last ditch effort to grow, which just means that the effort to grow still exists symmetrically. It's governments still have incentive to their people to improve the lives of people, which means they still attempt to do that in some capacity. They're just not successful at it in some capacity, right? But I also want to talk about like why government cares in status quo, because I think OG like touches on it but doesn't explain it fully, like why like they care about voters and so forth. Firstly, animals groups exist, right? And they've gotten more like voices in general, so they often have like multitudes of methods available to do their activism, which is like constantly like they're more developed, so they get more funding as you have this economic growth, so they go on and tell the government to like lobby for these sort of things, right? But also not that's beneficial when you have other actors like Beyond and Tyson coming in and selling vegan burgers for these countries too during the economic growth, because they want to be the biggest producer of vegan food across the world, because everyone is again getting it from them, which just means that US in the status quo when they're economic stagnation only have investment in like only give subsidies like to meat industry. So even if you stop certain animal hurting, government still subsidizes the meat industry. But on our word, they're able to invest in more like Tyson and these sort of products because they want to be the global leader in all of those things. So you just get far more new products, far more innovation, and because you want to be top of the world in these aspects, you just develop them more, which just means that as things grow, they start to get on a balance with these things, which then means that you just slowly fade away from like factory farming. But even if you don't do, like there's still less factory farming, because on their word, as population is going on, you just want to like have more animals, have them overpopulate to satisfy demand. On our word, you can satisfy it through like industry products, through like lab made products and so on, right? But also note that government does a far variety of more things. That is like government also cares about ethics, and so courts often give orders based on things on how these laws apply and so forth, right? But like often at times there's like news coverage and how these groups advertise these sort of things. So as you're in economic development, and you can focus on those sort of things. That is, government doesn't necessarily want animals to die, right? But they see it as a more proximate interest. Corporations don't want animals to die when they see all of this cruelty. But on their side of the word, they're okay with that cruelty happening because they want more poor profit driven. In our world, they're already profiting, so they can think about these things to some capacity, which just means that you get like more regulation that is happening. But on their word, like the governments are actually trying to drown out these sort of animal organization, right organization, because they're orthogonal to them. They want to develop in some capacity, which just mean like when more experimentation happens, all of these things, you don't want to innovate in some capacity, very proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for the eloquent remarks, and now we invite the member of the opposition.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I'll take at least one POI from opening government. I'm not looking at the chat, so please unmute. I'll also ask you for one verbally if you haven't given me one by like 5th minute. So just keep it ready. All right. Starting my speech. 3, 2, 1. There's been a lot of laundry list of impacts thrown at you by a lot of the teams in this debate. CO has one case. The economy is going to grow in a way that makes people want to farm more cash crops and use more fertilizers. This kills millions of animals who would otherwise have been living in the wild. When it stagnates, there's less demand. Note 2 important things about the way this extension is positioned. The first thing is that it's completely independent of any debate about whether or not regulations are affected by this. And it is also completely independent of a debate about what consumer tastes are. Because no one in this debate would question whether you want more food or less food when there's growth. If there's more people, they want more food. If there's less people, they want less food. And no one in this debate would question things like textiles would get more demand, for example, by people buying more clothes. This is a certain thing. This is independent of regulations, and it's not relevant to how the political system reacts. It's inherent to the motion. Growth, more demand. Stagnation, less demand. The second thing about this extension is that it affects the animals that matter the most. Let's explain why a stakeholder should be the only one you should judge this debate based on. The first thing is factory farming can't be your metric, because as opening opposition points out, life by itself might be meaningful. So when factory farming rises, you create more animals so you can use their resources. So for example, you have a chicken, which is in a really uncomfortable cage, which you can then kill later for food. We don't know if that chicken's life is utility negative. As of now, no one's done the analysis. If GovWip wants to waste their time on it, go for it. But in most instances, it's difficult to decide whether living a difficult life is just bad and not living at all would have been worse. As a result, factory animals, and whether or not they're born or not born, or their demand for meat rises or doesn't rise, cannot be the metric for this debate. It's too speculative. What can't also be the metric for this debate is other animals like pets, mostly because they have significantly fewer numbers in this debate, and also they're just much more likely to have protection, like the shelters that CG talks about. The most relevant stakeholder in this debate are the millions of animals that live in the actual wilds in the vast majority of the world, which is the developing world, where they live in forests, where they live close to farms. It looks like lions and tigers, the big name ones, but it also looks like things like gazelles and boars and cows and oxes and just different big animals that have feelings and lives as well. It also looks like fish in rivers and fish in oceans. First of all, why is it that this motion talks about the economic stagnation? Why is it stagnation stops farming becoming dangerous? First of all, note why stagnation hits demand for food really hard in a way that growth also flips. So the first obvious thing is cash crops. You buy things like coffee less often, chocolate less often when people just have less money, because people actually in these local areas like energy, which is like you use things like rubber and you use things like oil to sort of make things like cars and other automobiles, all of which is raw materials that are required. These all have increased demand during times of growth and reduced demand during times of stagnation. How does this affect farms? 4 things that are completely independent of any particular threshold. These are all spectrum impacts that will almost always occur in a farm. First of all, less access to more complicated seeds like genetically modified organisms. Second of all, it looks like you have less money for pesticides or insecticides or ways to keep your crops more safe. Third of all, you're often forced to do things like subsistence farm when you just can't earn enough money. If there's not people buying things in the market, then you have to make food that you can eat for yourself because you're basically going to starve otherwise. So often this looks like less farming. But fourth of all, often people just stop farming, sell off their land, and move to a different place because they can't make a living anymore because there's a high cost to farming. You're risking a lot of money that you have in your house when you own a piece of land because you have to keep investing to make that money back. And that money is often risky because of weather patterns, as well as the fact that the economy might not buy our food in the future. So people give up and go to cities where they have welfare systems and communities that can protect them. Why exactly does this affect pollution in a way that significantly helps animals? Two mechanisms, three ways to impact them. The first mechanism is toxicity and the branching impacts of this. Significantly more fertilizer often affects rivers through a process called eutrophication. In other words, if fertilizer runoff from your farm goes into the water, it was designed to kill things like pests and weeds. Often that's dangerous to other people in the environment as well, which looks like plants, other animals. This falls often into oceans and rivers because obviously in a farm, you're watering it, so the water like flows. And as a result, often these rivers start to flow that polluted stuff into other places like forests close by. But second of all, it's also true that a lot of these forests end up having animals eating this kind of food, eating this kind of fishes, and as a result, they end up being sick and being unhealthy and not being able to drink that water. Second obvious thing is acid rain. Often use of pesticides and fertilizers uses things like nitrogen, potassium, as well as phosphorus. All of these are acids when they're put up into the sky and evaporated after you've watered the plants, because the fertilizer is still in the water that you watered them with, which can kill animals close by. Third of all, antibiotics. If you give your plants things like, say, protection against bugs and pests, often, even if the pesticide itself isn't bad, the bugs react very quickly. And the structural mechanism for this is that bugs have very short lifespans. So often there were many generations in like a few months, they end up having a resistance to this kind of issue. And that means when they go out into the wild, animals who have built a resistance to these pests are now attacked by these superbugs, which kill them faster. And fourth of all, it looks like invasive species where you invent like methods to stop rats by putting more foxes in, more dogs in. All of this just means that the area around you is destroyed. What is the extent of this impact? What is the comparative and what is the weighing to make it exceptionally clear why CO should win this debate? Before that, opening government.
So you're saying that people are going to stop farming, they're going to go into the city. But my question is, won't the price of crops and price of agricultural goods increase and therefore create a market incentive for people to go into farming, therefore undoing the very effect that you're saying?
Okay, so your logic is the market is solved and nothing changes. The problem is that if there's less people who can buy more food, then there's less people who can create food to provide it to them because the consumers are gone. There's only a limited amount of like people buying food. The price stuff is irrelevant to this. And you can understand this as an average voter if you think about it. Okay, what is the extent of this impact? The first thing is farms are very close to a lot of animals for three reasons. The first thing is for fertility reasons. Often they're close to places like rainforests because it's these biodiverse places which have lots of plants where you have the fertility to plant things like farms in the first place. Second of all, they're close to pastures where you can graze your animals and keep them fed in the first place, so you can get cheap things like grass and grain easily. So they're close to other animals that live there. But third of all, rivers. It doesn't matter if you're that far from a place because the river often carries the actual issues as well as the water cycle of rain moving things around, makes it so that it doesn't matter how close you are to these animals and affects all of them. Okay, why is it impossible to regulate this? Much better analysis in OO, and what are the impacts and why are they so crucial? The first obvious reason is that you can't regulate something that's crucial to your economy in a developing nation, so people lose jobs. The second reason is that voting, it's really hard to piss off like 80% of your population that works in places like farms in Kenya or India. Third of all, it's extremely hard to regulate just logically because these people need to use fertilizers, right? You can't just check every single time they use it, whether it's going off into the river. So the impact of this is first on scale, just most animals, but second, it's long term. It's generations of animals getting sick and seeing like their families die and not being able to have healthy lives in the future, or for example, completely losing capacity to drink water because they're scared of that river and hence living torturous lives over time. But it's also compounding because the animals feel worse and worse. They run out of their habitats to the human areas, where the humans then kill the animals because they're scared of the animals coming into their areas, which creates even more destruction for these habitats, which means that it's a cycle of vicious violence, which means that the animals keep getting destroyed into the future. All of these impacts are crucially big deals and are big enough to win a debate, and Abhishek will do the weighing for that.
Okay, we thank that speaker for the eloquent speech, and now we invite the government whip. Give me a few seconds.
Can you hear me? Yep. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. I'll do several things. First of all, I will start with OO, then I will move to CO, and then OG. Okay. So let's start with the OO. Their first argument was that like there will be more factory building in our world, but I want to say this actually like you'll still build them in your case, like in a stagnation, economic stagnation too. But like in our case, you don't feel pressure to do that because, as my partner explained it before, government sees it as a trade-off, and like if there will be more like money in the economy, they will like have less incentives to like be dependent on the factories building. While in their case, they have to build the factories because the economy is not growing, which actually flips this argument and works in our case. And then there's a second thing they were saying is that humans live longer, and like first of all. I want to say they didn't even explain why, but even then, the same way we can say the money coming from these people also will increase. And like, as my partner said before, the population will increase too. It's like, you cannot just stop it. It will happen anyways in both worlds. And you, instead of like saying, oh, because of the economy, people like the population will increase, you don't want to solve the problem. In our case, even then the people will increase the population, but we're trying to help the animals and give the long-term solution that will maybe not happen immediately, but it will happen. And the third thing is that they're saying that animals can get positive experience. First of all, like they don't even like why, but like in our case, again, we're proposing the solution that will make their lives better because we're trying to solve the consumption of them less, and then it means that they will suffer and being killed less. While in their case, there will be continued killed, the factories will increase, and the consumption of the animals will increase. And then again, because of the economy is not growing, they have less money to improve this factories where they like kill animals. They have less cages, like smaller cages, will animals will suffer. While in our case, we're providing the long-term solution, but it will happen. And then but even then you're talking about like giving like these animals a few days, like a few happy days, like a year, and then being killed. While we're saying that we will less be dependent on the meat production, and my partner explains why, because we will have more ways to explore the vegan. It's the government have more incentives to spend money on the vegan production, the caring about the animals more. So yeah, now I will move to CO. So the first thing they're saying, the farms, is they have less access like to complicated seeds, less money for pesticides, and so on. CO's argument is like people buy less food during a recession. This is just super intuitive. The only industry that really grows in economic stagnation and people care about is the farming industry. Governments will always subsidize the fertilizers and food and give subsidies on the prices, try to cover profits of the farmers and so on. Because people's primary needs during their trade-off of economic stagnation happens on other industries like innovation, but farms will always be needed. So you just push these farms to produce more food. For CO to access their impacts, farms will need to shut down significantly, and they need to show how constant increase in population will be met. But also in their best case, not everyone can shut down the farms and move. Many people don't have the capacity or education to move and go to different things or start new businesses. Now, another thing that CO was saying is the toxicity, that like ossification designed to kill things dangerous to other people. Fertilizer still exists and are bad. If you stop economic growth now, it still happens, and you use a current kind of fertilizers, and which are as bad as the CO's claims, and it's used as much. If you keep developing, you can have better fertilizers. There are a few incentives for this. Firstly, human beings also don't want ossification and want to have less toxic food. And secondly, there's more increased research on all of these things. So there's something. So there's a constant push to have cleaner and better fertilizers. So this actually flips all of CO's impacts. Yeah. Now I want to move to the again. I want to go back to the OO, cover them again. Before that, I will take a POI from OO.
Don't let closing half strawman us. Our case was never contingent on regulation happening or not happening, but about the nature of sustained economic growth. Shaurya's 4 minute of DLO weighing. CO's case is just our mechanisms about byproducts, toxicity, pollution of farming land, and the specificity of fertilizers. They cannot outweigh us.
Okay, whatever. I mean, I'm not comparing you with a CO. Whatever. And corporations' incentives are compromise of individuals. Corporations of individuals also care about ethics and are also not super greedy. These things become important when you interact with animals' rights group. Corporations are the short is false. It's false. Corporations are short-termists. When they are performing poorly during an economic stagnation, when they are doing well, they also want to experiment, dominate, care about the PR, and thus invest in the long-term goals. They also get investments from government for different programs because, yeah. And now I want to move to the OG and explain how our extension is better. So Amesh explains to you that like, we will be less reliant on nature, and government has the incentives to be less reliant on that, and we will have more like we will exploring more vegan. We will more care about the animals. OG will provide a significant number of non-wash impacts and how it affects animals like pets. I feel like the OG does not really care. Like I mean, their impacts are not as big as we are like explained. So at this point, I think that it's obvious who won. Thank you.
Okay. I thank that speaker for the eloquent speech, and now we invite the opposition whip.
Hey, can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yes.
Sure. One second. Let me just look for my time. Yeah.
So they have a solvency base.
Okay, fine. Cool. Yeah. I'll be taking a PO at around the 5th minute, preferably from opening, but no preferences. Feel free to interrupt. Okay. Cool. Starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. Cool. I think first, let's take OG out of this debate. 3 pieces of rebuttal and 1 piece of weighing for them. On rebuttal then. 1 on incentive. The main crux of the OG premise is that at the point from doing growth, you have political stability, which probably leads to better governmental policy that can actually impact change for these non-human animals. 1, I'm very confused about what incentives the politicians have. The electoral particularly doesn't care about these non-human animals. I also don't think they independently have incentives in terms of, let's say, it appearing good for their campaigning. But also they're probably corrupt and they have ability to be influenced by multiple lobbyist groups who probably have incentives to harm these animal groups at the point from the engaging expansion, right? So I'm not very clear if incentive is fulfilled. Then, note, you may think that this is probably to an extent symmetric, because it's also rebuttal opening opposition uses. 2 crucial pieces of unique rebuttal. The second on capacity learn. Note, I think humans are uniquely terrible at helping solve environmental issues for one very basic reason. We have information paucity in terms of how, let's say, ecological changes are affected by the action that we do carry out. Note, The idea over here is very simple. Very famous, let's say, the honeybee case study, right? The honeybees are very important to ensure ecological chain being maintained and predator and prey chains not breaking down. We did save a lot of honeybees, but very recently it came out that while we then ended up saving the common honeybee that produces honey, we in fact fucked over many other bees that led to an entire collapse of the ecosystem. This is very crucial because many instances humans may do good, but actually end up committing more harm over there. So we don't know why the good intention decisions are in fact positive in nature. There's no analysis from opening government over here. But the final thing is very simply in terms of ecological theory that's largely prevalent, right? Note, most policy making is anthropological ecology at work. It is not ecocentric, it's anthropocentric. The crucial difference over here is you care more about sustenance in perspective of human beings. You want to reduce climate change because it makes human lives better. You don't care about climate change because it makes the ecology better or for them makes animal lives better, which then means the sustenance that happens on their side makes human beings and let's say affects them, and that's what they are prioritizing. They're not really caring about animals over there. I don't think then they're actually getting any solvency in terms of our animal lives are better. Now let's move on to closing government. Note, firstly, this rebuilding from the claims that they make on, let's say, why farming, etc., doesn't work, right? Note, I think there's some disconnect from reality over here. Shaurya makes a very simple claim. Sustenance farming, which is to feed people based on their basic necessities, which is like food, rice, bread, etc. That probably means symmetric on both sides because you have the same number of people, which probably means all of these people also need to be fed. What does change is a luxury goods being produced. Note, we have goods like coffee, expensive textiles, cash crops, for example, like expensive dyes, etc. Their demand is entirely related to the people's ability to buy this. This falls when the economy is in stagnation because people don't have the capacity as much capacity to buy luxury goods. The problem over here that Shaurya analyzes is very simple. If people aren't buying your goods, you have lots of goods that are unutilized. The business that was once profitable is now unprofitable, which then means that you don't choose to move to the city. You have to move to the city to sustain yourself. Very crucial because that then means all of Shaurya's impacts in terms of reduction in fertilizer uses on our side does apply, but increase on their side also applies because luxury goods increase when your price increases. Our case stands then in comparison to CG. But let's take their case down. Few things over here. One, I think they lack solvency. And I think it's very clear in your notes as well. They claim that, hey, animals are going to get fucked at the point of time you have stagnation. Doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll explain why for two reasons. One, when you're talking about pets, people really love their pets. They don't really give away their pets or euthanize their pets, etc., because there's a huge emotional attachment over there. The second idea in terms of stray animals, right? I think that this is more interesting to take down. The idea over here is very simple. At a point of time you have growth, cities are seeking to modernize. They have more influence and capacity to go ahead and clean up their streets, etc., in which these street animals are seen as deterrents, which then means there's more incentive to clean this up. On our side, when you have stagnation, street animals are not really a priority. You don't really care much about them. You don't really want to invest money in taking care of doing anything about them. The final thing then is on poaching or just increase in consumption of animal goods. That's once again ridiculous for a very simple economic reason. Most animal goods, for example, leather, etc., which is the main incentive for people to do poaching, are luxury goods. Demand for luxury goods goes down on our side because of stagnation, goes up on their side. I think their impacts then apply much worse on their side. Closing government is then out of the debate. Let's then crucially weigh against OO. Because you know what? O is right, but also desperate in their POI that they say a lot of stuff. The problem is how they say it. Note few things over here. One, I think O case is much more speculative than ours and is much more narrow in scope. Three things to observe over here. First, I'll note O has almost no comparative, especially in regard to Shaurya's speech. They never tell you what stagnation looks like. They inherently assume, one, that growth is going to be primary and secondary sector growth on site government. You know what? You can also achieve growth just by focusing on service industries. I don't know why then all of your harms in terms of toxic waste increasing happens in that instance. I think OG also points that out. Secondly, also very crucially, they also just inherently assume that, you know what? Because there's growth, you're going to have more pollution. That's also very confusing when you're talking about white products, right? Because you know what? Maybe technology is more efficient. Maybe batteries just become better, so less lithium is consumed, which then means the lithium waste that you're talking about doesn't increase, remains symmetrical on both sides. What Shaurya gives is extreme certainty. Refer more on PIOG.
Yeah, like it's not that like when you have drop in demand or like in economic downfalls and you stop like buying coffee, no, you're more likely to just cut corners and like burn coal again. And that's like the negative impact of stagnation.
I mean, it's bro, basic economics. You don't buy luxury goods when you have less income. Income effect in terms of demand and supply. I'm pretty sure the average reasonable voter knows that. But moving on, right? I think then the simple claim that we weigh over every other team is uncertainty, right? The O claim is much more speculative. The waste also may not be directly harming animals. We don't know where this lithium waste is going to. It's probably just maybe in a landfill. I don't know why it's harming animals. Shaurya 1 very clearly proves to you the specific sector that most certainly harms animals, right? Farm animals who are affected by the fertilizers being in the crops that they consume or that they graze on, in terms of effluents being part of the water that they drink or that supply downwards to their supply chains. Also, secondarily, the clash of rejuvenation that OG talks about, that's talked about in space, is also relevant because there's so many factors affecting it. I'm not very sure that it ends up being beneficial at the end of the day or harmful towards animal. Finally, and this is very crucial, right? We have no analysis on O, why animals feel more pain, more animal lives, etc. are saved on our side. So it clearly proves to why animals see each other suffering when, let's say, eugenesis occurs, when they see, let's say, the fertilizers, let's say, concentration of fertilizer, biomagnification occurring, why it's affecting multiple generations, destroying multiple generations. So very clearly much more long term, right? Because it affects the entire lineage of these animals and shows them through cycles of suffering. More may have more waste. We don't know what to do with that waste. We don't even know that waste exists or not. For certainty, very, very proud to oppose.
Okay, great. Thank all speakers for a wonderful debate.